Yo, how's it going, folks? Welcome to episode 150 of the Simpa Life Podcast, the big 150. I say this every time we hit a large number, but we are racking them up. I know it's taking me some time. I'm not quite hitting the Rogan numbers, but we're going to keep persisting with this podcast and having these conversations week in and week out. Although saying that, I am also aware that I was off the other week, so whenever we get around to it. Hope you guys had a wonderful solstice. I enjoyed a few days in the woods with a fire and some psychedelics, and yeah, barefoot, bit of grounding. Was wonderful to sleep outside, very much, cleanse the spirit and the soul. So hope you guys had some good fun and actually celebrated on the right day this year, because it was the 20th, not the 21st. I noticed in Glastonbury about 1,000 people traced up the hill on the wrong day. So bless yous. You were a second short for it being the longest day, but good attempt. All right, I'm not going to waffle on too much here, folks. I want to jump straight into today's guest because I think there's quite a lot of interesting subject matter and a lot to discuss. So yeah, without further ado, let's introduce today's guest, who is an American primary care physician, medical cannabis specialist, educator, author, public speaker, the board member of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and an advisor for the Parabolic Center, and they are one of the sons of the legendary cannabis proponent and psychiatrist Dr Lester Grinspoon. They are Dr Peter Grinspoon, sorry. How are you doing, Peter?
Doing great. Thanks for having me today.
No worries. Yes, really appreciate you sort of taking the time. Let's sort of jump straight into this. I'll ask you my same cliched question I ask most people that are involved in cannabis, and that is, how and when did you first get involved sort of with cannabis?
I would say at birth, because my dad was a cannabis scholar and a cannabis expert. He wrote a book in 1971 called Marijuana Reconsidered, saying that there were some harms of cannabis use, but generally that the criminalization was phenomenally more harmful than the use of cannabis. So he actually called for legalization in as early as 1971. And so growing up, we had people in my house against, for, debating legalization, passing around the peace pipe. So, I never really associated with anything bad. I associated it with interesting conversations and people trying to do good things in the world. And then additionally, my brother Danny fought an unsuccessful battle with childhood leukemia when I was 8. But it really helped him the last year of his life. My parents bought it for him. Unfortunately, they had to buy it for him illegally, but it really helped him with weight loss and pain and anxiety and insomnia and appetite. So I came to associate the smell of cannabis with medicine. And that really gave me a slightly different attitude going through medical school, where they teach you a lot of nonsense about cannabis. And I really have been in favor of it and treating people with it for my entire 25-year career as a primary care physician.
Excellent. Very concise. And yeah, I imagine so. From looking at the work, I mean, your dad, like you said, was not just involved in cannabis. It was in the 80s as well. I think I read somewhere the other day that he sued the DEA to try and
in
stop
1985. In 1985, he sued the DEA sort of single-handedly to try to keep MDMA from being put in Schedule 1 and locked away from medical research. My dad, in addition to being way ahead of his time in cannabis, in 1979, wrote a book called Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, shouting from the rooftops for the use of psychedelics, the study and use of psychedelics in psychiatry. And, he got crucified for that by Harvard Medical School. But now, 40 years later, we've got a huge center for the study of psychedelics in medicine. So you're absolutely right. He was way ahead of his time, not just with cannabis, but with psychedelics and many other drugs and drug policies.
It's interesting. It is fascinating to see that, that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, as they say. And you're kind of predisposed to it. I often joke on this podcast that a lot of I call them lifers, like the people that we're tied to this, bound to this, to help this cause, that we're kind of captured by it. You're on that pathway and you can't quite deviate from it. And everything you do in some way still goes back to serving that kind of overall mission. Like you said, seeing it as a medicine so young, and the way that it helped in the latter stages of palliative care with your brother, that's got to kind of, as you say, really imprint. I will have to be honest at this point, I haven't had the opportunity to read either of your two books, but I have looked sort of quite extensively at notes and whatnot about them. So I wanted to ask how then, because it's interesting, you had this awareness of sort of the illicit drugs or the unlawful drugs as being medicine, and then you went into medical practice. And obviously from the book you wrote, got the note over here, which the other book he wrote is called, can't see it, Free Refills. You speak in that of then the troubles that you have with addiction of these then lawfully available drugs, and it's such an interesting sort of juxtaposition that we're now having this moment of healing and recognition that actually the things we've demonized for half a century versus the things we've promoted for half a century, and the reality is just so jumbled.
No, absolutely. I mean, I became addicted to opiates about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It's part of it being how stressful it is to be a doctor these days. It's my responsibility. I'm not blaming it on anybody or anything, but, we called it free refills because doctors just have such access to medication. And then combine that with like the stress, the burnout. Doctors have a very high rate of addiction, but luckily I was able to overcome my addiction. As you mentioned, I did write a memoir about it, Free Refills, A Doctor Confronts His Addiction. And I sort of satirize like our treatment regimen. It's really bad the way we treat opiates. Only about 10 to 20% of people get modern, up-to-date treatment with like methadone or Suboxone. I do that in my clinic. I do buprenorphine or Suboxone. But it's really, our attitude towards drugs is a very complicated conversation because, opiates are addictive. And we do have an overdose crisis all over the place, particularly in the United States. We lost 107,000 people from fentanyl overdoses. But at the same time, the way our drug enforcement agency is dealing with it is like the most brainless way imaginable. They're like cutting down on the supply and pressuring doctors not to prescribe opiates. And like it's inhumane not to treat chronic pain or addiction. So what's happening is as they cut down on it, on the supply, more people are buying the drugs illegally on the street. And instead of eating or consuming medications from the pharmacy, they're consuming medications from the street. And that's why the overdoses from fentanyl go up as the DEA cracks down on doctors and on the supply. The war on drugs, this has been a disaster, not just for cannabis, but for everything. And for cannabis, as you know, there have been more than 20 million arrests, mostly people in the United States, people with black and brown skin, but more than 20 million arrests for nonviolent cannabis possession. And that's so much worse, so much more devastating than actually using cannabis. So my whole family, or my dad and myself, have been working to sort of end the war on drugs for like forever. I mean, it's still raging. We're sort of winning in the United States on the cannabis issue, slowly but surely. But the war on drugs is still going strong. We're not treating addiction very well. We're still criminalizing people. And I personally am in favor of decriminalizing all drugs to bring the use out into the open, to make it so that people can actually ask for help without getting in trouble, and to make the supply a lot safer. I think that with regulation and education, we could do a much better job than this like crazy. It's like a cottage industry. Law enforcement makes so much money off of this, and they're just not helping anybody. If you have trouble with drugs, and then you get entangled with law enforcement, you have your drug problem and your entanglement with law enforcement. You have two problems, not just one problem, and they both make the other problem harder to resolve. So I'm really not in favor of criminalizing any of this.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean,
I'm not sure that answered your question.
Well, as I alluded to before we started recording, I have ADHD, and this podcast we do jump around a bit, so by no means don't worry at all. It's interesting because we are in this point where you've got the odd spot here and there. Obviously, everybody likes to point to Portland or something like that and go, that's why drug decriminalization doesn't work, without understanding exactly, as you've said, that if that's then the one city or space in the whole of the west coast of America that then goes, you're safe, all the people that then want to be safe will firstly flock to an area. If then, as you said, there is no difference between non-problematic and problematic drug use, everybody gets tarred with the same brush, and therefore possession, and that person that then just had a bag and they shoot up, I don't know, once or twice a week or whatever. There are people that have that regulated control. You know, there's Dr. Carl Hart. He obviously advocates quite hard for what he calls sort of recreational heroin use or amphetamine use. And I would tend to agree with this, having benefited from a lot of stimulant drugs in my youth. But I agree entirely that I'm now nervous in my mid-30s about the idea of using chemical drugs, of using engineered drugs per se, things that are not naturally derived.
Even medicine?
No, from the illicit market. So getting access to MDMA, things
I was like you're not worried about blood pressure medication.
Oh, no, I'd like to think my blood pressure's all right. I do have some trepidation of, again, it's the I'm not, some people paint me as anti-capitalist. Maybe so, maybe not. It varies day to day, I guess. But I do worry about the incentive of profit in any given industry, and that rather a conversation of going, well, when was the last time you exercised? Have you thought about doing X, Y, Z? And these holistic, less invasive and financially beneficial interventions don't seem to happen, especially here in the UK. Our services are collapsing. And then I look at a lot of the media and things you see coming out of the States. I really enjoyed that Michael Keaton special about Oxycontin. Was it Sick?
Right. By the way, our services are collapsing too. Where our general doctors and primary care doctors are all leaving because the hospitals and the insurance companies are acting like, a psychotic version of Amazon, and capitalism is just wrecking our healthcare system. So in that particular sector, we're in the same boat as you.
It's interesting because we're trying to now over here go towards an insurance-based system, and there's a big move in America towards obviously getting away from an insurance-based system.
Do not get involved with insurance no matter what. In the United States, we pay like way more than any other country per capita, any industrialized country for healthcare, and we get much, much less and have worse outcomes. And it's because, number one, the hospitals are becoming greedy and are funneling all the money to their shareholders or to their executives. Like the executive of my hospital just gave themselves a bonus from like $3.5 million a year to $5 million a year, whereas the doctors and the patients are all starving, and the insurance companies literally just suck money for themselves and add nothing. I would avoid insurance. Just have have socialized healthcare, have National Health Service. That works much better. Anything works better than what we have. What we have, if you're rich, you get good healthcare. If you're poor, it's awful. There's no safety net. So I would avoid what we have in the United States. No matter what you do, don't do what we have. Nobody's happy with it except for like the top 1%.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're worried about over here. So we got companies like Bupa moved into the UK like a couple of decades ago, and there were just private alternatives. And it was fine when it was socialized healthcare, as you say, with the NHS, and then just the private alternative. It meant you could jump a few queues, you could save a few weeks or whatever.
Right.
But what they then started to do was invest more money into this and outsource the NHS services to these places and go, well, they're more efficient. And it's not that they're more efficient. It's they've only got 1,000 people on their books. You've got 60 million. Do you know what I mean? And so they then changed and tricked the economics of it. And after 20 years of divestment, the average poor person is saying we need that new system because they can't get a dentist. In the UK, I think now as our opposition, our Labour opposition, because obviously we're going into election next week, actually, or it might have already happened, guys. We have probably got a new prime minister by the time this is out. He's saying that basically the biggest contributory factor to why children are visiting A&E, as in under 18-year-olds in the UK, is dentistry. They're getting rotten teeth. So we have the same mechanism we have in the States of like good food deserts. So everything's pre-packaged, really crap food that's low nutrients, full of all these preservatives and additives and sugars and sweeteners and things that just dysregulate the body. And without then having regular health care alongside of it and everyone else's health generally falling, people look around and go, well, I'm above average, not recognizing, like you said, the detriment to it. And we're obviously decades behind you guys in terms of the cannabis conversation, but we now have medical access. I'm one of about 40,000 patients that get access to it via a private healthcare system. So again, it's another avenue that's taking money away from the NHS. In my ultimate vision and dream, and I pitched this to the former opposition leader who would have been, but not for like 10,000 votes in a few seats, the Prime Minister. National Health Service grows cannabis.
Well, the weird thing about your program for medical cannabis is that you need a specialist to prescribe it. You don't general doctor, a primary care doctor, isn't allowed to prescribe it. And that's like literally nothing against the UK or the medical cannabis program. That's literally the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life, because the primary care doctor, the general doctor are exactly the people who ought to be prescribing cannabis. First 100%.
Of all, the scary thing is though, Peter, they're the ones like, say, for example, right now, I'm on a 3-year waiting list for autism assessment because of the backlog of services in the NHS. I'm prescribed cannabis by a specialist. When I go to my GP, I'm told I'm a druggie. No, I'm told that I'm abusing the system to try and get illicit drugs, and they're anti-cannabis. They're not allowed to prescribe it. Quite a lot of them are still so bigoted.
They were anti-cannabis in the U.S., and now they're becoming pro-cannabis because they're realizing, the doctors are realizing, A, they don't know anything about it. B, everything they've been taught about it's nonsense. And C, their patients are doing really well. So the smart ones are like listening to their patients and saying, maybe there is something to this. But in my book, Seeing Through the Smoke, my book that came out recently on cannabis, which is available at Amazon and a bunch of other places, the chapter 4, doctors are supposed to do no harm. Chapter 4 is called Do Be No Harm. And it's all about how doctors have been on the wrong side of the war on cannabis. And they just were, in the 1800s and early 1900s, doctors prescribed cannabis very freely in the United States. And then when it became criminalized in 1937, doctors were against it becoming criminalized because they thought it was a really helpful medicine. Then they were sort of bludgeoned by the propaganda wars, and then doctors became really anti-cannabis, not knowing anything about it. And now slowly, they're becoming in favor of it again. About 2/3 of our general doctors now think cannabis is a helpful medicine. And, the general doctor knows the patient, knows their family, knows all the specialists, knows the meds they're on, knows all the things that haven't worked in the past. They're exactly who should be prescribing the medical cannabis, not these specialists that know a lot about one teeny little area of medicine and don't really know the patient. So you guys in the UK have it exactly backwards. You should be encouraging the general doctors to be the ones to prescribe medical cannabis. Because again, the other thing is, the most important thing is like really safe and open communication between the patient and all the doctors. And if the doctors make you feel bad about cannabis or any other drug use or alcohol, you're just not going to talk to them about it. So the doctors have to do a much better job of, like, even if they're against it or like most of them don't know anything about it, creating a healthy, productive, trustful climate where people can talk about these things. Because you can't get help and you can't watch out for drug interactions or things like that if the doctor has no idea you're using a particular drug or substance. So we need to do a much better job of like open doctor-patient communication.
100%, yeah, 100% agree. It's a very difficult system here in the UK, like I said, because of we had austerity in 2008 when the financial world crashed. Most of Europe went, all right, we're going to do tax mechanisms. We're going to figure out localized incentives to kickstart our economy. The Tories basically lied, manipulated, or once the coalition got into power, they lied and manipulated the statistics and the figures to constantly show that we were not in recession, when in effect, we've been in recession the whole goddamn time. And like I said, our services have gone off a cliff, and I haven't seen who is the name of my GP in over 10 years. You go and if you're lucky, you can get a GP appointment within the week you want it. But you've got to ring at 8 o'clock every morning and get put in a digital queue. And then there's 3 usually women receptionists that are stressed out of their box trying to answer all these phones and having to deal with people that are too nervous because we're British, we're reserved. We don't want to go to A&E. So we'll wait, and literally we're getting to the point of them people are turning up and you're already done. Do you know what I mean? You could have gone with a small little lump, and then by the time you actually get seen, stage 3.
Well, we're catching up with you. I think you guys are a little bit ahead of us in terms of like health service falling apart. But believe me, the United States is catching up with you guys. A lot of doctors are trying to unionize because they're just getting trampled. They're just like their pay cut, their work's going up. An article just came out that said for a general doctor to get all their work done, they'd have to work 26.2 hours a day. So it's really broken. It's irretrievably broken at this point. If they, I don't know, there's a whole other conversation how to fix it. But
so could one of the solutions potentially be, because I mean, I'm torn massively between the artificial binaries that are created by the language and the legislation. So things like cannabis and hemp, and it's like, no, it's all cannabis sativa L. Hemp isn't even a subgenus. It doesn't exist. It's a colloquial term that we got through classic Latin, through Grimm's Law and Proto-Germanic that led into English that then literally means cannabis. It's only used as a way to separate. Same with we get these binaries of medical and rec. And I almost feel like there's a certain part of cannabis definitely belongs in medical infrastructure and it should be accepted and researched and whatever else. But I think there almost needs to be a closing between the rec and the medical. And I don't mean that to make it all medical, but I mean in a way that people recognize that even if you're just smoking weed, it's going to have some effects. You have to then understand how that would then affect the contraindications, like you say, for the medications, lifestyle choices. Are you mixing it with tobacco? Like a lot of Americans are rolling with nicotine leaf blunts, you know, and then not aware that they're, oh no, I've washed the nicotine off it, and you're like, yeah, you're still getting exposed to a lot of these chemicals and these things. And now with the vapes, and we saw with LA the pesticides recently in the LA Times investigation, and I don't want it to be just white lab coats over here, because I know I can grow high quality organic cannabis in my bedroom. So I know what it can be done. But then, like you said before, when we let capitalists run away with it, we're ending up with all these consumable hemp products like HHC, THCP, while we're still not allowed to talk about THC. We're still not allowed to federally get that out there. And do you know what I mean? I just feel...
Absolutely. You know, these hemp-derived products are completely unregulated. Like, you have no idea what you're getting. Is it Delta 8? Is it Delta 10? Is it random industrial byproducts? There's like literally no adult in the room, completely unregulated. And, you know, again, back to capitalism, like it's much cheaper to make a crappy product than to make a good product. And if nobody's regulating it, people are just going to go for the money. And there have been a lot of studies that the use of these products is much higher in areas where cannabis is still illegal. You know, half Americans live in a place where recreational cannabis is legal, and the other half live in a place where it isn't. And where it's not legal, people rely to kind of approximate the medicinal benefits or the recreational benefits of cannabis. They rely on these hemp-derived products, which are really, really sketchy and dubious. They're like semi-synthetic cannabinoids. So what would be much safer is just to legalize for recreational use and, you know, just have sensible regulation and taxation so that adults can use it responsibly, like they could use alcohol. Certain percentage will have a problem with it, less than alcohol, but that doesn't mean you criminalize the whole thing, because that just creates this gray market in these really, really crappy and dangerous products.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the language of sort of legalization small L, but legalization big L, as in a proper noun, is this corporate kind of takeover. And what I'm seeing in various jurisdictions around the world where legalization takes hold is the criminalization of the individual still remains. If you have, oops, 1 gram too many, oh, naughty, naughty, oops, you were in the wrong place with it, naughty, naughty. It feels it's limited.
But these days you get a ticket instead of going to prison.
But that's, so, I get that, but it's, I mean, in the States it's different. I mean, I did a road trip around America, and I visited like Colorado and Washington, California. I actually was lucky enough to spend some time in Boston as well for a while in 2018, I think it was. And I've seen sort of how loitering works, and you're a very litigious society, and you'd like to give your tickets out. Over here in the UK, we're a bit more, and we're trying to avoid that. And with the industry that I want to see sort of emerge in the UK is kind of decrim, then legalization, as it were, or ideally what's happening now with this conversation, which is the next question I want to ask you about, rescheduling versus descheduling. Because in my opinion, it should be descheduled. We either have to schedule alcohol and nicotine products and frankly fast food and fats and dairy products and really go into some stuff, like as Terence McKenna always pointed out, it's all drugs, baby, it's all drugs. We either have to go nanny state like that, or like you say, we have to then just have this education and awareness. Best product possible, best environment available to consume it. This is how we all have pubs and things like that. The self-regulating environment, bartender cuts you off. Your mate says, how we'll get you in a taxi, we'll get you a pizza on the way home. So they feed you, look after you. Do you know what I mean? If we have that infrastructure, I think then we don't have that to me is a better way of dealing with it than kind of arbitrarily punishing people. Because again, if you're well off, a ticket and $100 fine is nothing. But as you say, if you're quite broken, especially if you're having a tough week or whatever, and that $100 ticket comes in and you miss that, eventually that can lead to incarceration. And so it still feels like there is this uneven playing field that if you then have the money or the connections, then you just supersede it. But then if, like you said, if you're a black or a brown individual in a predominantly white neighborhood and a racist cop pulls up, do you know what I mean? It might then suggest that the product that you have in your pocket wasn't lawfully acquired, that you were out here illegally selling it, or you're trying, do you know what I mean? Or in Canada, for example, where teenagers are still criminalized. They've gone a lot better in various things, but if you're under, I think, 19 in most of the jurisdictions, you can get a criminal record for it.
I mean, that's the last thing you want is a criminal record for cannabis. I mean, again, the criminal record's much worse for your health and future well-being than the cannabis uses. It's completely backwards.
100%. I think it's is it Gabor Mate? He did some work around the determinative factors, and there's like a list of I think 10 of them. And for every one that you have of these, your likelihood of experiencing problematic intravenous drug use over your lifetime increases by like fourfold. And one of them is literally this being tarred as a criminal, because even if you don't necessarily get the conviction and that holds you back from jobs or etc., you are internalizing a narrative. You are a criminal, you are bad, you are less than, and you are wrong. Yet other people that sin in different ways to you, like the guy that's lawfully got his Oxycontin prescription, that crashed his car because he had too many pills, he can argue in court that, oh, the piece of paper protects him and it wasn't the same. But the guy that unlawfully got access to it, that maybe had less, wasn't driving erratically or whatever, but got pulled over and didn't have the lawful right to have that in their system. So it's the hypocrisies that I worry of.
There is a lot of
we're
hypocrisy.
setting trends rather than setting best practice amongst ourselves.
There is hypocrisy, though. If you get in a car accident and too much OxyContin, you still get in a lot of trouble.
Well, but if you've got a good lawyer, again, it's a thing. If you've got a county defender versus, say, a good lawyer comes in and goes, well, actually, my client's metabolism has been slowing down due to age and da-da-da-da-da, and they could work out BMI and bring in loads of things to confuse that situation enough that the jury would go, you're right, he didn't intend to do that. But so it still allows there to be a cosh, an optional cosh that the cops and the authorities can pull out when they want. And I just don't like them having that tool in their pocket, while then I see the same people, frankly, that often 10, 15 years ago were the prohibitionists, now the investor capitalist groups making all of the money, while my neighbors in our economy, our legacy culture that has survived on cannabis for decades, when legalization comes, we won't benefit. They'll just come and take our money.
Issue of like, that's why I consult for this group, the Parabola Center, which is wonderful. It's run by this fantastic woman named Shalene Title, and it's trying to shape the cannabis industry so that it just doesn't become another huge conglomerate. You know, it's interesting with the cannabis industry. Part of it's, you know, made up of people, legacy growers and activists and people who've been really involved in trying to help people for the last 50 years. And part of it's like alcohol and pharma and tobacco moving in, and they just don't care about anything. So, you know, this group, the Parabola Center, and many others, you know, the Drug Policy Foundation, a lot of people are trying to shape the cannabis industry in a way that like actually helps people, not just creates another like sort of unhelpful corporate industry. It's difficult though, because, you know, it's hard to fight against people with deeper pockets.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I'm trying to win a Hearts and Minds campaign, and that's why I bring people on each week and we have these sort of conversations. Obviously, I have the audience. I write for Weed World and do what I can do where I can to always get people to think of the little guy. That yes, because your balance sheet is showing plus numbers and whatever else. There's quite a lot of people quite nervous about Colorado's latest numbers, and they're like, "Oop, the industry's lost $700 million," and it's just because it was 700 million less than previous. I think in the past 2 years, their tax return is down about 30% as well. And so the mechanisms by which they've constructed these systems, I think we're going to see this like boom and bust, like we saw with housing, like we saw with the subprime mortgages in America or the dot-com bubble. And I think once they've had their boom and bust, a few of their crazy big money, then they'll kind of leave it to the people who actually give a shit about cannabis. But I just worry about how many lives are not just ruined through interactions with police and the prohibition limiting their potential, but also the lives lost because of people taking a combination of drugs that are lessening. Like my grandmother died from effectively her immune system eating itself because of arthritis and the approach that they had to that with it. It's just eventually the body was too weak. The protocols to deal with the arthritis just boom. Whereas I was trying to talk her into weed for so long, and she worked in palliative care. She was a nurse. She knew this shit. She used to tell me stories of, oh yeah, back in the 80s, we got that sticky oil and all these, but she'd never do it herself. And she had such trust in that system. And this is what I'm saying if I have this difficulty in going, all right, science is science on one side, but profit is profit. And if there isn't a viable alternative that costs nothing, if she could have grown them in her wonderful garden with the green fingers that she had while she had them, did you know what I'm saying? So I want this holistic approach. I don't just want to see it pigeonholed as a drug for the rappers to be bouncing around the club with, or then just this token new medicine or this flash new innovative product. I want people to really understand what cannabis is, because it's not just a drug. in terms of what the plant can provide in terms of a resource, like it's the end of petroleum, it's the end of plastics, it's biofuels, it's now energy storing with supercapacitor batteries. You know, we can generate electricity through it, making it into graphene and running salt water over it. There are so many more next level evolutions of this that can tackle climate change, global poverty, you know, tackle global migration caused by resource wars and things like that, that we're still stuck on this first page, as it were, going, oh, but is it a drug or is it a medicine? Who gets to regulate?
Well, I view it as just another tool in my toolbox, right? I mean, as a general doctor, like some things work for one person and some things work for another person. And, you know, the treatments we have for anxiety, pain, nausea, insomnia are just not great treatments. They're not that effective and they have a lot of side effects. So I just feel like if you're my patient, you're having insomnia, we could use a sedative. We could use cannabis. You know, of course, we get you exercising, not drinking as much coffee, you know, going to bed, you know, without doing anything really exciting right beforehand. We do all the non-pharmacological things, but it's becoming normalized. It's going to take a while, but it really is becoming normalized. Patients love it. And a lot of people find it more beneficial and less toxic than the traditional pharmaceuticals. Other people don't like it. They don't like the feeling of being high. They don't like the anxiety. So, you know, again, it's just like another tool in our toolbox. And it's sort of unreasonable if people think it can cure everything. It can't. And it's unreasonable when doctors think it can't cure anything, because it really does help people alleviate symptoms. So, you know, I actually think, at least we're developing in the United States, a lot more common ground about it. You know, most people, you know, most sensible people think that it helps with nausea from chemotherapy, that it helps with anxiety, insomnia, with chronic pain. And most people are understanding, or more people are understanding, that it's not necessarily good for teenagers. We don't know that it's safe with pregnant or breastfeeding women. It might make things worse if you have like an unstable coronary syndrome. And if you have a family history of psychosis, you should use it with extreme caution, if at all. And I think we're developing more common ground. And I agree with you. It doesn't have to be like one extreme or the other. Like you reject it or you fully wholeheartedly accept it for everything. I mean, I think it's just, you take it in context and look at the pros and the cons, and then compare it with the other things you'd be using, and just try to have a reasonable, measured approach to it.
Yeah, 100%. It's actually, you're quite a good person to ask this question. So, I mean, I've found from my own various quite extensive studying of cannabis and consuming it, that it's quite a metacognitive inducing substance. It causes great introspection. And I have a certain theory that a lot of people that get anxious from cannabis and don't like the feeling of it is they're thinking about themselves and their behavior, and they're being self-critical and analytical. Whereas I've done some less extensive research into pharmaceutical drugs in my youth. And a lot of them are very closing of the mind, very narrowing, you just move through. The days pass, the time passes, which again can happen on cannabis at high, different doses, different cultivars, and different profiles affect people differently, as you say. But generally, a lot of people, when they consume cannabis, will start to think, and therefore I think that leads them, or it gives more emphasis towards them being able to self-motivate, to go out for that walk, to, you know, engage in that exercise, to try and sleep better, to try and eat better. Am I just...
I agree with you. I agree and I disagree. I completely agree that cannabis can cause insight, introspection. I have a whole chapter in my book about not just harms, benefits, or medical uses, but about lifestyle enhancement, because it really, really can help people have insight about themselves, about their relationships. It could help people more mindfully connect to the present. It could help them connect to other people. It can, help them with really important things like help a lot of people write, help people with ADHD. It can help people connect with sex, art, music, creativity, spirituality. Absolutely. Number two, cannabis can cause anxiety. It's biphasic. In low doses, it can generally help anxiety, and if in high doses, it can make it much worse. This varies a lot person to person, but that's one of the problems with like our dispensaries. You know, the person who works there, the bud tender, will be like, "Hey, we have a 3-for-1 special on edibles," and people will take too much, then they'll freak out. So I agree that it causes introspection, and I agree that it can definitely cause panic attacks. You can end up in the emergency room with a awful panic attack with your heart racing if you take too much. It's a really miserable experience. I think that the thinking the cannabis gives you can contribute to the anxiety, but I think there's a lot more to the anxiety than just overthinking. I think it can be really a chemical effect with like your sweating and your heart rates going. I mean, I'm sure you, like most cannabis users, have accidentally taken too much. And it's a lot more than just you're thinking too much. It's just like everything's out of whack and your reality is just not what you want it to be. So I agree that it can give you insight. And I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't ever realize. A lot of doctors don't ever realize. There's been so little talk about the benefits of cannabis and such an overemphasis on the harms. And, both are equally important. The cannabis users have to know about the harms because then you can make an informed decision. Like, I don't think smoking cannabis is particularly helpful. I think a lot of the harm, if you just studied cannabis without smoking it, and you just study illegal cannabis, not the illegal crap we've had for the last 50 years, it would come out a lot safer than a lot of the previous studies show. So the people who are, in favor of it and who use it should know the harms. If I drink at a barbecue like beer, I should know what's bad about it so I can make an informed decision. And the people who are against it still use the words medical marijuana in these derogatory quotation marks, and they desperately need to know more about the benefits. And as doctors, we're just not really allowed to talk about the benefits of cannabis. A study came out a couple of years ago saying that people aged 18 to 30 had more fulfilling sex lives if they use cannabis. Which is not a surprise to anybody who's ever used cannabis before, but it was a study, and it's good to have these scientific studies. And I tweeted it, and a couple of these addiction psychiatrists tweeted back at me really angrily, like, "You're encouraging drug use." And it's like, I'm not encouraging drug use. It's just we talk about the pros and the cons. If a study comes up that's a good study, not one of these stupid studies, it's just trying to find harm however they can. But if a good study shows up showing a harm of cannabis, I'll absolutely post that. So I just think both sides need to be a lot more open-minded about both the harms and the benefits so we could have a much more helpful and informed discussion.
Again, 100% agree. I can't help but feel, this is another question for you. I don't know if you've heard this before. So we in the UK have a phenomenon called skunk psychosis. And it's a buzz term that was created from what we can see, but I'll throw in an allegedly here because I can't be asked with whatever trouble it'll give me, from GW using, again, other individuals I'm not going to name, allegedly writing under a pseudonym in one of the famous Sunday newspapers here in the UK. And it slowly created this kind of narrative of this phrasing of skunk psychosis. Obviously, at the time, GW Pharmaceuticals were patenting and working on a product derived from a cultivar of skunk number 1. And there seems to be this institutional intention of getting this idea that cannabis causes psychosis, but when we produce it, we somehow take the psychosis stuff out of it. And so it's created this binary here in the UK of exactly as medical cannabis is now the safe, good thing, but cannabis is the bad, dangerous thing. So I understand like protocols, procedures, as we were saying, but the UK industry right now, we've only got, I think, one domestic grow site. Everything else is imported on a bidding system, effectively, to the lowest bidder around the world. And there are products that are allegedly failing tests in markets where they're not allowed to be sold in Canada or various states in the US that then end up as a medical product prescribed in Europe. It's then been irradiated and whatever else, and it's gone through a process, they say, to make it safe. But it's that product is less valuable, less medicinal, less of quality than what that person could have potentially grown at home. But we, again, as you say, have these divisions, and I just don't know how we get around that. Like, is the idea of cannabis causing psychosis a big thing in like the medical cannabis space within the US or the rec space? Is it something that comes up much?
Yes, it's one of the main arguments that people against cannabis have. And it's not a completely illegitimate argument. I mean, cannabis and psychosis are heavily associated. And there are 3 different theories. One is that the cannabis causes the psychosis. 2 is that the psychosis sort of causes the cannabis. Like if you're sort of pre-schizophrenic and you're just, nothing is really making sense to you, that you smoke a lot of cannabis to like treat your own symptoms. So like the mental illness is causing the cannabis use. And 3 is that there's sort of a shared genetic liability for heavy cannabis use and for psychosis like schizophrenic. I think the truth has a little bit of all 3 in them. I don't think cannabis causes schizophrenia because the rates of schizophrenia have been very stable for the last 70 years, maybe have gone up a little bit. The rates of cannabis use worldwide have gone from like maybe couple 100,000 users to a couple 100 million users. They've gone up 1,000-fold. And if cannabis were causing schizophrenia, the rates of schizophrenia wouldn't be flat or like slightly going up, which might even just have to do with how we detect and treat it. They'd be going up. They'd be skyrocketing. But I do think that cannabis can destabilize people with psychosis. And if you have a family history of schizophrenia, you should really avoid cannabis because it can trigger it earlier, which is a big deal. If you get psychotic disorder at age 26, it's better. It's still awful, but it's better than if you get a psychotic disorder at age 19. That's 7 years you could be learning adult skills and becoming more independent. So I'm very careful with cannabis and psychosis. At the same time, it's been very exaggerated. You have this like really a lot of this nutty research from England, which I won't go into in detail, but it's like it says that most of the psychosis or a big part of it's due to the strong cannabis. And that's not true at all. It's like, people who are sort of pre-psychotic might seek out strong cannabis because they're trying to treat their symptoms, or as I mentioned before, they could have the same genetic liability. So I just think it's been, on the one hand, like everything in cannabis, the whole psychosis issue has been very propagandized against to kind of turn public opinion against cannabis. But there's a lot of truth to it at the same time. And it's only through having a sensible discussion where, the pro-cannabis people don't say, oh, it has nothing to do with psychosis. And the anti-cannabis people don't say, everybody that smokes is going to become psychotic within 2 minutes. There has to be a middle ground where you can like dispel the myths, but also really legitimately address the legitimate medical complaints. And again, it's all about open communication, and it's all about finding common ground, because cannabis isn't perfectly safe. Like no drug or medicine is perfectly safe. And the question is, how can we use it society-wise with benefit and to minimize harms? And we could only do that if both sides sort of stop exaggerating.
Yeah, exactly that. We're pumping out a lot of crap, and it seems to be getting exported from the UK. In America, generally, from the sort of longer term stuff that I've looked at, it was always the question of, is it related to schizophrenia? As you said, that's generally kind of been dealt with by just a casual observation of statistics over time. There would be, as you say, these
but there is a strong association. There's no question. They're really. Remember, association is not causation, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody that goes on to be addicted to heroin drank milk as a child, but the milk, they're associated, but the milk isn't causing the later heroin addiction. So they sort of deliberately confuse those to scare people, but association is not causation.
Yeah,
it might be contributing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all I was going to say that is in the States, there seems to be this conflation, whereas over here it's more this, we talk of it in this like temporary psychosis. And over the past few years, I don't know, again, if inform me, please, if they're doing this in the States. What we've done for the past several years is they've conflated the products that they've created as a byproduct of prohibition, synthetic spice, semi-synthetic cannabinoids, and like left, right-hand molecule versions of facsimiles of cannabinoids. And so these things have proliferated across the country. They're decimating our prison population. Fentanyl's making its way into UK prisons from people I've been speaking to as well, folks, which is great to hear. Same with nitazines, which is all good fun. But yeah, my point is that they're using all of the figures, that's cannabis. So they then say that all these people who have these psychosis events on synthetic cannabis, it's not even related to cannabis. They've based it loosely upon the chemical structure of it. They conflate them together and go, that's cannabis psychosis.
Well, absolutely. And again, I don't think cannabis has to be yet another issue that we beat each other senseless about. I really do think we can come to some common ground. But certainly these synthetic cannabinoids are much more dangerous than actual cannabis. As you mentioned before, they're used where cannabis isn't available. And I do think that synthetic cannabinoids like spice can probably, destabilize people with psychosis even more than regular cannabis, because it's stronger, like really just bombard your cannabinoid receptor. At the same time, as you say, none of this is good for the open, reasonable discussion because people become alarmist about it. And the solution is really to legalize cannabis and regulate it, not to prohibit it. All you do when you prohibit it is create this illicit market in these dangerous gray market semi-synthetic cannabinoids. So I'm with you completely. It doesn't help the conversation. It doesn't help the patients. The only thing it helps is like the whole law enforcement establishment, which is making a lot of money off prohibition. And it's not fair to people. People deserve, people are allowed to, it's my belief that people are allowed to experiment with their consciousness, and this goes for like psychedelic drugs, not just for cannabis, as long as they're not driving when impaired, as long as they're not like, shirking adult responsibilities, as long as they're not violent or harming other people, people are allowed to experiment with their consciousness. And somehow law enforcement in our society is like intruded into that and is criminalizing the whole process. And, every society throughout history has used intoxicants, like every single one. It's just very hypocritical which are the good drugs and which are the bad drugs. I'm allowed to prescribe you oxycodone. You're allowed to walk around with it with a prescription bottle, but heroin, which is virtually the same thing, maybe one teeny little chemical difference, is illegal and you go to prison for possessing it. Like there's so much hypocrisy I wrote a recent piece on my Substack. I publish every couple of weeks on Substack. And it was about, good drugs, bad drugs, like the complete hypocrisy. And then, that changes over time. Like cocaine used to be a medicine in the United States, and as did cannabis, as did heroin.
I mean, it's technically still is in the UK.
Exactly.
I think we're one of the world leaders. This is an old statistics, folks. You might have not quote me directly here. I think it was 2016. We were the world leader of importing of medical cocaine. And there is a huge discrepancy between the large number, a double-digit number of kilograms that comes into the country versus the single digits of kilograms that go out in products afterwards. It is a very interesting divergent system. I mean, look at Coca-Cola, and there's a lot when you're really looking at what, like I say, has happened with cocaine. And this is why you've got Bolivia and Colombia and countries like that, like knocking at bloody what do we call them? The UN, and going, can we do what they're doing with cannabis with all this coca leaf? Because it's everywhere.
Yeah, no, there's just so much hypocrisy with drugs, and we could do a lot better. As my dad, who, as we mentioned before, was a cannabis specialist, he was actually a specialist in all drugs of use and misuse. He said if these drugs don't necessarily make the users act irrationally, they certainly can make non-users act irrationally. And I think that sort of underlies our entire policy towards drugs since the beginning. The war on drugs is just got to end. We're harming people. We're not helping anything by criminalizing these substances.
And I think, there's a huge argument for, I personally, one of my favorite stand-up comedians is a guy called Bill Hicks. You may be familiar with him. He does a stand-up set where he's like, if you're really against drugs, go home, throw out all of your albums, get every record, every bit of music, every book, destroy everything, because everything great of art that has been done, those people real fucking high on drugs. And it's like, look at what's happening now with art. We're moving to AI-generated art because, again, all the creative people, it can be shown in certain areas. So you're seeing, again, in the lawful markets in some of the states in America, real creative people and real new innovation, new events, new formations, new communities, new incentives, new initiatives, new ways of thinking. I want to see that globally. I can't wait to see what art looks like, what movies look like, TV shows, what books will be written, what poetry produced, what could actually be done when these people can it
could also help your scientific process or your writing. A lot of people find it really helps their writing. And in a chapter in my book, the chapter I mentioned about lifestyle enhancement, I talk a lot about Carl Sagan, the astronomer. He talks extensively about how cannabis helped the scientific process and helped him really, as you mentioned, insights, things he never would have thought of before. He would use it. He'd have all these wonderful insights. The next day, he sort of edit what he wrote down. About half of them would be silly and nonsense, and about half of them would be like really, really important things that he never would have thought of otherwise that ended up in his books. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it can really help people, and we're preventing this with the criminalization. We're also preventing people who get into trouble with it because a certain percentage do get addicted like they do to any other drug from getting help because it's criminalized. So personally, I know I don't want to beat a dead horse, but personally, I just think that most of the harms from cannabis come, or as many come from the criminalization as from the actual use of it.
100%. And then I think a large percentage of the rest come from a lack of meaningful infrastructure and access of true access of all of the products that could be available, not just this lab shopping and be like, we're 45% THC. And, because it's the race of, it's the paradox over here. One of our minor parties called the Liberal Democrats, who, shit the bed, frankly, in coalition in 2010, they just betrayed all of the centers and center to left political people that they were representing. They've come up with a policy in their manifesto that they want to legalize cannabis in the UK to tackle skunk so that they can reduce the THC content. And
first of all, that doesn't really understand how or why people use cannabis.
Exactly. This is the point of it. It's so absurd. I'm breaking it down in an article that I'm writing for a new project we're launching next month, guys. Legacy Culture. I mentioned it last week. Check it out. They don't understand the US market either, because they're looking at the US market going, we want to do that to limit THC. And I'm like we were just saying, they're shopping. People go in and go, what's your highest THC? No matter how much the bud tenders, the educators, the people that actually care are going, you want to know about flavonoids, terpenes, you want to know now about like volatile sulfuric compounds and all these other organic compounds. And there's so much more to it. But people are going, what's your number? Big number, I'll have that.
No, well, yeah, we do kind of fetishize high THC, which is a mistake. We should be breeding down the THC and breeding up more of the other medicinal cannabinoids like the CBDs and the THCVs. But number one, people titrate to their own level of comfort. Like a lot of people don't like taking too much cannabis. Some people like 1 puff, some people like 2 puffs. And, the people who don't use or understand or try to regulate cannabis think of it as like heroin or alcohol. People always want more. But I mean, with alcohol, a lot of people just want to drink. They don't feel good with 3 drinks. And the fact is people titrate to their own level of comfort. So it is a sort of, I think, a little bit hysterical, the focus on like super high levels of THC. I mean, the main harm of super high levels of THC are that you can accidentally overconsume, and if you do take the same 3 hits of like 30% THC that you took in college 40 years ago that was 3% THC, you can overconsume and have a horrible experience. But aside from that, people do tend to titrate to their own comfort. And I think, ironically, when I was younger, growing up with my dad, people would say, oh, you have to smoke a whole joint. That's bad for your lungs. Now they say, oh, you have to just smoke 1 puff. That's dangerous. Like the plant can't win. Which is better? You smoke a lot or you smoke a little bit? And the final thing is, if you limit the THC, because people titrate to their own level of comfort, all you do is strengthen the illicit market. People can't get 20% THC at the store. They'll just go to the illicit market, which is huge. And, furthermore, the final thing, I said that was the final thing, but the final thing is to limit the THC makes it a lot more expensive because medical patients need a certain amount. So if you make it 10%, they're going to need twice as much than if it's 20%. And a lot of people are on fixed incomes, are veterans, are seniors, and they can't really afford it. And the last thing we want is for medical cannabis to become yet one more treatment just for the well-to-do. So for all these reasons, I just don't think potency limits. I mean, sure, who needs like 98% wax? I mean, maybe some of the really outrageous stuff, but like for the plant, I just don't think it helps anything to try to arbitrarily impose these potency limits. I think it just shows sort of a misunderstanding of the fact that people don't want to take more. It's not like an opiate. You want to get higher. Like people get anxious and uncomfortable and feel weird if they take too much.
Yeah, it's like I said, people can titrate through the mechanism kind of we were speaking of before of a consciousness about it. There is what's that American drug? It's not Benadryl. What the hell is the one that people take and forget it and take another one?
Ambien? No.
No, is it Ambien? It might be Ambien.
I don't know. We have a lot of drugs.
Yes, I think it's Ambien that I'm thinking of from several sort of depictions in mass media of, people sort of taking it and then they've forgotten they've taken it, but they'll get into a problematic space. Whereas cannabis is a conscious awareness of the high, as you were saying. And so you get to your point of comfortability and you can titrate within it and move around within it. And I think it's important now that we're trying to have these conversations, obviously, like saying about extracts. They're not necessarily available here in the UK. They're trying to now bring in vape pens, like liquids, but they're like 10% isolate in an MCT. Did you know what I mean? They're not, again, understanding, as you say, like one of what I personally believe, and I think it's slowly going to be bore out over time, is the higher, obviously, the THC number, the less the percentage of the other components of the product could be.
Exactly.
And I think the entourage effect, for all it's contentious and keeps going in and out of, is it pseudoscience? Is this correct? I think we're moving more towards there being a scientific mechanism, but we don't quite understand. And I think that's partly to do with possibly the mechanism as to why spice messes so many people up is, as you say, it's because it's so much higher than that level of THC. These are not just playing on your endocannabinoid receptors. They are neurological transmitter enhancers. So there is then something in this other way, these other pathways that it's affecting in the brain. And I wonder, or I theorize, that the same creativity of Carl Sagan going, yeah, I wonder what that planet would do if XYZ happened. That when you take that spice, it's just that turned up to 11, and you physically can't deal with it. So the average individual, you kind of have that temporary psychotic break of just like, same like salvia. Like salvia is just a dissociative, just blow you up for a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's just really sad because, we've evolved using the plant for 5,000-10,000 years. And, again, it's just been illegal for the last 70 years. For most of the time it's been, and it'd just be a lot safer if we had it legal, regulated. There was sensible education about it, had good packaging. You knew what you're getting. You knew what you weren't getting. It were like it is in Massachusetts where I live. It's very well regulated. It were tested for fungus, lead, heavy metals. Yes. You're not getting anything bad in it. And it would just be so much safer, the whole thing. It's just so ironic that they criminalize it in the name of safety and they make it so much more dangerous.
Yeah, 100%, especially in the US, when you guys learned a pretty strong lesson about prohibition in the last century. And that's what I thought when cannabis was happening. I was like, oh, they're going to realize all of the drugs. And then it slowly became, no, it's cannabis and psychedelics and other drugs. And I'm like, and then they've gone, oh, no, but MDMA, we're going to take that. Ketamine, we'll have ketamine as well now. And they're just slowly picking it off. And when they find a good use of amphetamine, they'll be in there and they'll get the amphetamine. And
there's data for the ketamine and there's data for the psychedelics. And we do use amphetamines all the time for ADHD. We use Adderall. So, but again, it all comes back. I love this blog I wrote called Good Drugs, Bad Drugs on my Substack. It just goes through each of these drugs and the hypocrisy and how some of them are deemed by society as like good, helpful drugs. And some of them are like just fodder for this moral panic we have to fuel the war on drugs. But there's not really a difference between the drugs. It's sort of arbitrary. It's like someone threw a dart at a dartboard and said, okay, that's one of the good drugs. Let's send that to pharma so everybody can be an Adderall. Whoop. Oh, that's one of the bad drugs, methamphetamine. You're a very bad person if you use it. Let's put you in prison. It's so ridiculous. There's no sense or rhyme or reason. And all it does is harm people.
Yeah, and it's crazy then and I always point this out to people, like methamphetamine and methylate dioxide is MDMA. Meth is in MDMA, and it's people get, or like you say with the amphetamine, if then going, oh yeah, but Ritalin, we give it to children and it's fine. But that guy recreationally using a gram over a weekend, whatever, yeah, maybe sniffing it, probably not the best protocols, or there are various, but the hypocrisies of it. It's like, if this is safe for a child, granted with medical supervision, etc. I just look at food, for example. Like in the UK, the rule is basically you can be as morbidly obese as you want, and the doctor basically goes, I think you would benefit from losing weight. That's the one conversation you have that one time. They'll say it maybe once every few times they see you, and that's as much as their legal intervention can be. I'm not necessarily.
You have the injectable medications yet? The Wegovy and the Ozempic.
Ozempics, they're slowly moving over here. One of my favorite.
Those are amazing. Those are amazing medications.
One of my favorite authors who I've been trying to get on this podcast for a good few years, Johan Hari. His recent book, he's just, I've watched quite a few of his interviews. I'm waiting until his book drops in price over here so I can give that a read. But from looking at it again, it could be something fantastic. But I think there's almost like a sickness in modern Western society. There is this capitalist consumption at all costs of going, well, if I take a little bit, it's good. More is better. And then it's okay. I can, like South Park did an episode where Cartman's eating like KFC and cereal with milk, and he's taking the Ozempic. And after a week, he's going, I lost a pound, guys. This stuff really works. And it feels like we're trying to take the cheaper thing of it, because I'm not sure the doctors are then going to be going, well, are you going to eat healthier alongside of it? Do you know what I mean?
The doctors do. The patients don't really listen.
Yeah, that's true.
Some do, some don't. The ones that are motivated, more and more we're understanding that like highly processed foods are like really bad for your heart, really bad for your memory, really bad for everything. Like, so the French fries, the hot dogs, the frozen pizzas, all this stuff is really, really bad for you. So I think there needs to be much more of an emphasis on lifestyle medicine and nutrition and sleep and exercise, the basic things. But keep in mind the doctors are dropping like flies in the UK and they're dropping like flies in the US because they have about 10 times more work they can do and they keep cutting their salaries and cutting, their support. So on the one hand, we can do much better with all this, exercise, diet, just counseling patients on basically how to live healthy lives. People know so little about nutrition. Doctors know so little about nutrition, but at the same time, like our safety net is just, withering and dying. And it's hard for people to get access to their doctors. And then when they get access to their doctors is for their chest pain. They don't really have time to talk about like, how much coffee am I drinking? And is that affecting my sleep? So we're really in this negative cycle. It's really bad.
Yeah. And I will state, people comment every so often, I can get quite overly caffeinated. I know ADHD people shouldn't really consume caffeine, but I'm sometimes immune to it. Sometimes I just don't notice I'm going 1,000 miles an hour. But
you gave me a little plaque that's in my office that says, without caffeine, I have no personality whatsoever. I literally, honestly, the first thing I do every morning is watch my coffee maker drip until there's enough caffeine for me to take a couple sips to digest the coffee, and then I drink more. So
but again, we look at if they criminalize coffee tomorrow, if it was suddenly like the war, same. I've got my refill in my cup and keep going through it. Yeah, the worst tachycardia, sweaty palmed, and actual audible hallucinations I've ever had in my life. Bear in mind, I've taken quite a lot of entheogenic drugs. Was caffeine, was lack of sleep and caffeine. And I literally had a point where I had to pull over because I was kind of hearing chatting. It was like just my thoughts, but I could hear the sound of it.
There's one chapter in my book about how addictive is cannabis that you would actually love, because I go through the hypocrisy of how addictive is caffeine. And I go through all 11, things of like, do I have cannabis use disorder, or the like tolerance, withdrawal, use despite negative. And I actually had 0 out of 11 for cannabis, but I went through it with caffeine and I had all 11. I had the most severe. And just for hypocrisy, I just used the same criteria. And I would say about addictiveness that caffeine and cannabis are about equally addictive, but that's a perfect example of what I was talking about before, of like the hypocrisy and the moral panic and the good drugs versus the bad drugs. I mean, by all, caffeine can cause, palpitations, heartburn, anxiety, insomnia. I mean, it's hard to argue that caffeine's safer than cannabis, but one's been stigmatized and one's advertised and everywhere at every social or academic event you go to. So it all goes back to like the hypocrisy between the two different drugs. They're both plant-based medications that help people function. And one of it's been so, the whole war's been fought against it, and the other sort of lionized, just like alcohol is lionized. It's so we need to really start from scratch with all of these drugs. Forget everything we know, and just based on the evidence and based on people's experience, come up with a whole new way of categorizing their harmfulness or lack thereof.
100%, 100%. And I would, I think that if we could have that, I mean, it's going to be difficult because there's so many peripheral industries, and it's that house of cards, isn't it? There'd be so many lobbyists that would be like, no, we can't have that conversation because our entire industry is predicated on it.
Well, we have an industry that you don't have, which is awful. We have a private prison industry. Now, in what universe, talk about capitalism going amok, in what universe should there be private for-profit prisons where the incentive is to keep the prisoner and have them come up with some rule violation and have the prisoner stay in prison longer so you can make more money? Prison's supposed to rehabilitate people, not make people rich. So yeah, there are all these incentives. I think the U.S. Wins in terms of like these crazy incentives to do the wrong thing when we have things like private prison syndrome, for-profit prisons, but for-profit rehab centers are absolutely nuts. They're so full of it.
Oh yeah, like there's a term I learned the other week when I watched a documentary. What do they call it? It's a term for urine in the rehab industry.
Liquid gold.
Liquid gold. That's what they call it. Liquid gold, because of how much fucking money they make from just testing piss. They're taking the piss quite literally.
It's awful. It needs to be much more regulated. And, that's what I was talking about before, like only 10 10 to 20% of people with opiate addiction get medical treatment like methadone or buprenorphine, Suboxone. Most people get stuck in these stupid rehabs that don't accomplish anything and except bankrolling the families, bankrupting the families. So it's not just so we have a fraying social safety net, but also a lot of the treatments are just ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's it kind of feels like, again, if you look at sort of American history, I'm looking obviously across the pond, but you've kind of got slavery, you've then got the Civil War, you've then got your Jim Crow era, and then you've got the war on drugs. And well, racism's over. And then you again look at, like you said, the statistics on this, and they've got, black and brown people from poor neighborhoods in prison earning like 50 cents to $1 an hour, making like license plates and working for big corporations. And it's a modern slave trade. I can't remember what the latest statistics are. It's like 1 million people are in for drug offenses.
It's absolutely awful. It's just crazy. I mean, we need to do a lot better. And people are realizing that. Public opinion in the United States is very much against the war on drugs. The only people who want to keep it going are like the Republicans, and not even the Republican voters, the Republican politicians. They hate legalization because it brings young people to the polls who vote for Democrats. So, but most Americans, Republicans, independents, and Democrats are in favor of legalizing cannabis. It's not even close.
Yeah, is it Pew? I think it's one of the polls that I've kept an eye on over the years. Yeah, I think it's up to 70% or something like that now. It's really climbing, and it's interesting. Then we've got. I'm aware of the time here, so I'll only ask a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. But I'm aware of one thing I learned, God, nearly 10 years ago, something like that the vast majority of the DEA's budget is made up for cannabis destruction. And then when you look into that, a large part of that money is just to destroy wild cannabis. And they turn up in spots and they're like, who planted this cannabis? And they destroy it. But what they do is they wreck the ground, create carbon sinks with it, and trap the seeds. The seeds then sit, and then after a few cycles, get into a preferential climate and then start growing again. They then turn up and like, who's doing that? And they're shadow boxing nature. And so when the DEA...
I mean, in truth, a lot of people do plant cannabis on national forest land.
Oh, yeah.
But if they discover it, you don't get your stuff confiscated. I agree with you, it's a total waste, and the DEA should be completely disbanded because they've gotten every single drug completely wrong from the very beginning. But in truth, people do. Part of why they do that is because people plant these nice farms and like federal land, which you're not really supposed to do, so they can't get confiscated. You can't confiscate the federal if the government already owns the land. So
yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose the other thing for people to bear in mind, just to add to the previous points there, is it federal seizure forfeiture?
Sheriff. Oh my God, yeah, that's where like if they suspect you of any drug dealing, without even proving it in court, they can just confiscate your property, and that's a perfect example of a huge industry that is fighting tooth and nail to not end the war on drugs, because the police can basically snag anything. Oh, nice sports car. You might be drug dealing, and they could just confiscate it. Very few limits on it, and it's very hard to get your property back. It's awful.
Yeah, it just seems like a same sort of continuation of an oppressor-oppressed paradigm that just we can't seem to quite quash. And you
mentioned Carl Hart earlier. His book, Drug Use for Grownups, addresses all of this. It's an excellent book.
Yeah. Again, another person I would very much like to get onto the podcast at some point in the future. I'll keep persisting with that. I'm aware. I'll let you go in 2 seconds here. Peter, I'm going to ask you the last two quick fire cliche questions I ask people. First is, what are we not talking about in sort of the space that we should be talking about?
Well, there's tons of stuff that we should be talking about. All the scientific discoveries that are around the corner, the endocannabinoid system, which we're just discovering, and with the fact that we're not teaching doctors nearly enough about any of this stuff, doctors or nurses. So there's a lot of, or the ways in which cannabis can be used. My most recent blog, which came out yesterday on Substack, is the fact that people are transitioning from alcohol to cannabis, how we can help people with that, and how much harm reduction it results in. Because, in the United States, we had 172,000 deaths last year from alcohol, which is more than the 107,000 we had from opiates. and people can use cannabis to transition off both of those. So that was my most recent blog. So yeah, no, we could go on for days. There are a lot of really, and for people who are interested in this stuff, my book, as you can see in the background, Seeing Through the Smoke, goes over all of this in extreme detail. And what I pride myself about this book is that it sort of argues it from both sides. It's not from one side where cannabis cures everything, cancer, whatever, you stub your toe, you smoke cannabis, or the other, it's like the satanic lettuce that you take a puff and your legs fall off. It really goes over, excuse me, the first part goes over the social history, which is pretty ugly, and the doctors being on the wrong side of the war on drugs, how that happened. The second part goes over the harms and what are real harms and what are the fabricated harms to the war on drugs. Then the benefits, what are the actual benefits and what are the things that people think it could do, but it can't do, like it doesn't cure cancer. And then the fourth part is about lifestyle enhancements, all the things that we're not really allowed to talk about as doctors because we get accused of promoting drug use when in reality, we're just trying to give a very balanced discussion of both sides of a very complex issue. So if people are interested, I go into a lot more detail on basically everything we talked about in my book.
Excellent, excellent. I suppose then the final question is, where can people keep up with you? I'll include some of the links below, but where would you like to direct people if they're interested in your work?
Just go to my website. It's just www.petergrinspoon.com. It's grin like smile, spoon like fork. So it's just www.petergrinspoon.com. You can get my book. You can book an appointment with me if you're interested in medical cannabis. You can ask me a question. There's a contact me button. So if people think of questions that come up, like after listening to this, they could send me emails. So I would just catch me on my website. That sort of has everything all together. You can get hooked up to my Substack. It has everything.
That.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, Peter. We've covered quite a lot of the topics I wanted to there. There's maybe the odd one here or there. So I'm maybe looking to invite you back on the podcast later on into the autumn, if that's all right.
Well, thank you for the great conversation. I really, really enjoyed it.
You too. You too. All right. Excellent. I'll let you get off and I'll do some housekeeping. So thank you very much, Peter. And
okay. Well, nice chatting with you and have a good day.
You too. Peace and love. Bye. Well, there you go, folks. That was Dr. Peter Grinspoon. I very much hope you enjoyed that conversation. A bit of a short one this week, as Peter had to get off to a consultation. As he said, though, he did enjoy the conversation, and I don't think I got an answer to the question, would you like to come back in the autumn? But I'm pretty sure, given that he enjoyed it, he will be interested in coming back on, so we will hook that up. One thing, as we did mention, as we're recording and talking there about synthetics, or synthetic and semi-synthetic cannabinoids and cannabinoid analogs, I guess. I suppose, yeah, that's the best way to describe it that I can think of off the top of my head now. We will be doing a special with Dr. Callie Seaman, like I said, at some point over this month, because it'll be July now, I'm guessing, by the time you folks are seeing this. So yeah, keep an eye on that if you would like to learn more. Obviously, yeah, check out the links below for Peter's website, for his Substack, where you can keep an eye on his work. Yeah, went through most of the questions and the notes and topics I wanted to discuss. There's quite a few, actually. I just didn't seem to find the time to quite ask the questions. So yeah, I do think I'll be seeking to get Peter back on the podcast before too long to continue this conversation. Yeah, I'm not going to keep you much longer, folks. I'm going to let you get out and enjoy the sunshine, because it's bloody warm here. So I imagine it's going to be bloody warm wherever you are. It's summer. It's always bloody, well, no, it's not always bloody warm. This is so British. I'm saying the word bloody and complaining about the weather at the same time. That's, yeah, new achievement unlocked is going to appear on the top of your screen there, folks. Peak British, 50 gamer points. Right now, I'm done. I'm cooking. I'm actually starting to sweat too much in here. So I'm going to stop talking shit, folks. I am going to direct you to not just simpalife.com, because obviously there's not that much new on simpalife.com yet, because I've been working on other projects. Obviously, I'm launching Legacy Culture with Tyler Green. That should be going live anytime around the time you're seeing this. So do check out the website, legacyculture.co.uk. Check us out on all social media as well. I'm guessing we'll be pushing the socials as well. Legacy Culture UK across the board. Yeah, I'll be producing a lot of my content moving forward through Legacy Culture. There will be various things still going on to the Simpa Life, so do continue to check it out for various back catalogue of things, including my Weed World articles, etc. Yeah, if you enjoyed this, please do give us a like, a share, a rating, a thumbs up, anything you do to show appreciation. I appreciate you for doing it. It helps me defeat this algorithm, which really doesn't like me because of the language I use, because I fucking swear too much. The content of the conversations we have mean that we're quite controversial and therefore not really promoted, although my reels do seem to go somewhere occasionally, or shorts rather, on YouTube. So I am grateful that YouTube hasn't fully started cracking down on us having these conversations yet. Touch wood. But yeah. All right, folks. Check us out on all social media platforms at The Simpa Life. Yeah, be beautiful to each other. Have a wonderful week. Stay warm. Stay hydrated. All right, we'll see you next week with, I don't know. You'll enjoy it. I'll enjoy it. All right, peace and love, folks.